Okay, now let's discuss chapter 11, which is about public goods and common resources. So what's the basic feature of public goods and common resources? Well, both of these two types of goods don't have market prices. In previous chapters, starting from chapter 4, right, we always discussed the supply curve, demand curve, and then the intersection of these two curves would give you the market price. So you can see that market price plays a very important role in the market economy, right? But you can see that in our life there are a lot of consumption goods. They don't have market prices. Think about nature, right? So if you hike a mountain, and if it's not a national park, then most likely you don't need to pay any fee. And if you walk by a river, you don't really need to pay a fee, right? Or ocean, you don't need to pay a fee to maybe swim in the ocean, right? And then there are some products provided by the government, and you don't need to pay any fee to use that product, right? Such as parks, roads, or bridges. So you can see that the feature that these consumption goods have no price, it's actually a pretty important one, right? Because we know that price in the market essentially is the force to allocate resources. And you can see this very easily. So when you have a price, consumers with willingness to pay higher than the price will make the purchase. And then producers who have a cost which is lower than the price will produce these consumption goods. So in the end, if there are no externalities, the market will be efficient. However, you can imagine that if there is no price, such force of allocating goods across consumers and producers will be missing. And you will see that because of the feature of no price, the competitive market is not efficient. So again, in this case, when there are no prices, we will need government, at least sometimes, to improve the competitive market outcome. So to understand public goods and common resources, obviously we first need to define what are these different types of goods, right? So first, let's define two basic concepts. To understand different types of goods in the economy, we want to think about two basic features of these goods. The first is this consumption good excludable? What does this mean? Well, it basically means that if a consumption good is excludable, then people can be prevented from using the good, from consuming the good. For example, cell phone service, right? To get cell phone service, you have to pay for it. And if you don't pay for it, even if you have a cell phone, you won't get any cell phone service. The same thing applies to, let's say, cable service, right? Or Netflix, you have to pay for it. The second feature is about rivalry. So we want to ask, is this good rival in consumption? It basically means that if I consume the good reduces your consumption, then there is rivalry in the consumption. For example, if we are drinking beer, right? So if I drink this can of beer, then you will get no beer. So there is rivalry in the cans of beer. So depending on whether this consumption is rival or is excludable, we can actually categorize the consumption goods into 4 different types. So if there is rivalry in consumption, and if it is excludable, then we call this consumption good private good. For example, ice cream cones closing, right? Obviously, you can see that there is rivalry because if I eat this ice cream cone, then you won't be able to eat it. And it is also excludable because you have to pay for it. So the other case, if a consumption is, there is rivalry in this consumption, and it is also excludable, then we say this is a type of club good. So one example is cable TV, right? So basically you can see that you have to pay for cable TV to get it. And you can see that there is no rivalry in consumption because if there is this TV show, I can watch it, right? And you can also watch it. And if I watch this TV show, my action will not reduce or decrease the quality of this TV show, right? So there is no rivalry. And the third type of good is common resources. So basically, if there is rivalry in consumption and it is not excludable, then this is common resource. So you can see that the first example is fish in the ocean. You can see that there is indeed rivalry, right? Because if I catch all fish in the ocean, then you won't have any fish. And you can see that it is really not excludable. So if this ocean is in this international water, then no country can have a right on this on this piece of ocean. So basically anyone can fish there. And the second type is the environment. So everybody can enjoy the environment. So it is not excludable. However, you can see that there is this rivalry, right? Because basically, if I pollute the environment, then you will also suffer from this pollution. So there's rivalry. Okay, now the fourth type is the public good. So if there is no rivalry in consumption and it is also not excludable, then this is a public good. The first example is tornado siren, and you can see that there is no rivalry. So basically, it means that my ability of hearing this siren will not reduce your ability of hearing this siren. And you can also see that nobody can be excluded from hearing this siren, right? If you and I live in the same village, and if there's a siren in the village, then everybody in the village can hear it. Now, national defense, it's always a very typical example of public good. So you can see that first, there's no rivalry because everybody will enjoy the same level of protection from national defense. And you can also see that there is no excludability, right? So basically you can see that as long as you live in Canada, then you will be protected by this national defense. Okay, now let's see this example, which will give us a idea on how to categorize different kinds of goods into different categories. So the question asks, a road is which of the 4 kinds of goods? So clearly we're looking at a road. And for a road, there could be 2 different cases. So the first is a road can be a toll road. And the second case is whether it is congested or not. Right? So if it is a toll road, then you can see that this road, then you can see that it is excludable. That is, if you pay the toll, then you can drive on the road. If you don't pay the fee, then you cannot drive on the road. And depending on whether this road is congested or not, we can discuss rivalry, right? Which means if this road is congested, then there is rival in consumption, right? Because on a very crowded road, if I drive on the road, then maybe you cannot drive on the road anymore because it's very hard for it, because it will be very hard for you to drive. So you can see that if a road is uncongested and there is no toll, it is a public good, right? Because uncongested means no rivalry, right? So this means there's no rival. Non-toll means it is not excludable. And then the second type of good is a club good. In this case, we're talking about non-congested toll road. In this case, you can see that there is no rivalry, but it is excludable. And the third type, congested non-toll road. In this case, there is rivalry. And if it is a non-toll road, again, it is not excludable. So in this case, you can see that it is a common resource. Now the fourth type, if it is congested, then there is rivalry. And if it is a toll road, then it is excludable. So in this case, it is a private good. Obviously, you can see that this chapter is about public good and common resources. So in the rest of the lecture, we will only focus on these two types of good, public good and common resource. Clearly, you can see that there is a reason why we want to focus on these two types of good, because both public good and common resources, they both are not excludable. And you can see that because they're not excludable, there will be externality problems. For example, in the case of public good, then providing public good has a positive externality. The reason is because if you provide public goods, then other people can become better off without even paying for it. So this is a positive external benefit, right? And then in the case of common resources, then consuming common resources will have negative externality. The reason is because recall the definition of common resource, right? There is rivalry in common resources, which means if I consume the common resource, then my consumption will reduce your consumption. So basically, my consumption of common resources generates this negative external results, right? So in this case, you can see that there is negative externality in the consumption of common resource. Okay. Define public goods and common resources and give an example of each. Well, obviously, to define these two types of goods, you only need to remember their features, right? There are two sets of features, right? So the first one is about rivalry, and the second one is about excludability. So for public good, there is no rivalry, right? And there is no excludability. And for common resource, there is rivalry. And there is no excludability. Well, there are many examples you can talk about, and you can see that the lecture notes provide some. For public goods, so we know national defense, and for common resource, we could talk about clean air. Okay, now let's talk specifically about public goods. So to understand public goods, so let's first start a very simple example. So let's imagine that there is a town in Canada, right? So there is a town in Canada. They will want to put up this fireworks on Canada Day. We assume there are 500 residents, and each of them will place a $10 value on the fireworks. So you can see that the total value for fireworks in this small town is 500 times 10, which is 5,000. And let's assume the cost of fireworks is 1,000. Now, what is the efficient result? Well, obviously, in this very simple case, you will want to compare benefit with cost. The benefit is 5,000 and the cost is only 1,000, which means if the town decides to set up the firework, then you can see that there is a net gain of $4,000. So clearly, having a fireworks display is an efficient outcome. But now you can see that fireworks display is actually a public good, right? Why? Well, because there is no excludability. So basically, if the city decides to do this fireworks display, then everybody can see it. And there is no rivalry in consumption, right? Basically, if I enjoy this, you will also be able to enjoy it. And my enjoyment of the fireworks will not reduce your enjoyment of the fireworks. So this is a public good. Now let's ask whether a firm, a private provider, will be happy to provide this fireworks show. So you can see that the firm will never want to spend the money to put this fireworks show. The reason is to recoup the cost of setting up the fireworks display, the firm has to sell ticket. But you can imagine that most likely nobody will want to buy the ticket because fireworks, right? The fireworks display is not excludable, which means people, they will have an incentive to be free riders. So what is a free rider? Well, free rider is a person who gets the benefit without paying for it, right? You can see that in this fireworks display context, the resident in this town will just sit on their balcony, right? Watch this fireworks for free. So there is no way for them to actually pay for this. And the notion of free rider is pretty easy to understand, right? So if you imagine that 5 people, they're doing a group project, and one person never puts any effort, right? And after finishing this project, this one person will get credit, right? So you can see that in this case, there is a free rider. Now, what is the solution here? Well, because the private firm will not want to pay for this fireworks display, then we could ask government to pay for this fireworks display. Now, how this government can pay for it? Well, it's pretty easy, right? The government can just charge taxes from everyone to fund this fireworks display. And you can see that the value everyone puts on this fireworks display is $10. So even government charges $2 tax from everyone, then you can see that the consumer surplus, right, for everyone is still $8. And you can see that in this case, everyone will be happy to pay this $2 tax to enjoy this fireworks display. And in the end, indeed, there will be a fireworks display. So this example is pretty easy to understand, and it basically tells you that first, in the case of providing public goods, the free rider problem will prevent the private market from providing public goods, right? That is, in the case of fireworks display example, no private firms will want to set up this fireworks display because the firm knows it will always lose money. Now, you can also see that in the case of public goods, government indeed has a role. That is, the government can step in and solve this provision problem, right? So government can provide the public goods. And of course, to provide public goods, the government has to charge taxes. Okay, we further have these examples of public goods. The first one is national defense. Well, we have talked about this. The second type of public good is basic research. So, basic research is a public good, right? Because think about Coase theorem. So it's a theorem proposed by Coase. And you can see that this is a public good because it is non-excludable and it is non-rivalry, right? So basically, everybody can learn about Coase theorem. And my learning of Coase theorem will not reduce your learning of Coase theorem. So Coase theorem is a type of public good. Now, specific technological knowledge is not, because it is protected by patent, right? So just think about any technology firms, right? Think about Intel. It produces computer CPUs. Obviously, these CPUs or the technology in manufacturing these CPUs, they're not public goods, right? Because the specific knowledge in producing CPUs is protected by patent and their intellectual properties. Third, fighting poverty. So the policy or the result of fighting poverty is a type of public good. The reason is because by fighting poverty, we are building a better world or a better economy, and everybody can enjoy this better society, better world, right? So it is not excludable. And you can see that it is also not rivalry, right? So basically that I can enjoy this better world and you can enjoy this better world, and my enjoyment will not reduce your enjoyment. So it is not rivalry. Okay. Now clearly you can see that in providing in providing public good, the government has to charge taxes, right? So you can very easily see that charging tax will generate some deadweight loss. So this essentially tells you that whenever government is thinking about providing public goods, the government has to decide the benefit versus cost. Right? So the government needs to do the cost benefit analysis to think about how to optimally provide public goods. So what is cost benefit analysis? Well, it's really easy to understand, right? So it's really a analysis to understand the cost versus the benefit of providing a public good, right? But you can see that this sounds very easy, right? Because it seems like you just need to compare two numbers. What is the cost? What is the benefit? But you can see that it's actually a very hard job, because how do you precisely measure the benefit of a public good, right? So let's say you want to measure the precise benefit of national defense of Canada. It's very hard to come up with a precise number, right? So you can see that it is hard. Okay, let's review this little section. What is the Freerider problem? So whenever a person, a consumer, is enjoying the benefit of something without paying for it, then it's a Freerider problem. Why does the Freerider problem induce the government to provide public goods? Well, if there is a Freerider problem, it means that consumers will just free ride, so they will not to pay for it. Then if consumers don't want to pay for it, then suppliers will don't want to supply it. So the private market will fail to provide public good. That's why we need government to provide public good. How should the government decide whether to provide a public good? We just talked about this, right? So the government needs to do this cost benefit analysis, comparing cost with the benefit, and then the government can decide whether to provide this public good and the quantity of or how much to provide this public good. Okay, let's talk about the second guy, common resources. Remember the definition of common resource. Common resources, they're just like public goods. They're not excludable. However, common resources is different from public goods in the other dimension. That is, there is rivalry in consumption, right? So what are the examples of common resources? Clean air and water, right? So basically, everyone can enjoy clean air and water. However, if I pollute this clean air and water, then my pollution will reduce your consumption of clean air and water. Congested roads, well, we talk about this, right? Basically, everyone can drive on this congested road. However, if I drive on this already congested road, my driving will make your driving more miserable, right? So there is indeed rivalry in the case of congested road. And fish, whales, and other wildlife. So this essentially is talking about fishing, right? So in the ocean, you can always fish, at least on international waters. However, if I fish whales or other wildlife in the ocean, then my action will reduce your ability to fish these wildlife. Okay, you can see that for common resources, there is always this problem of overconsumption. And the reason is because there is rivalry. However, everybody can use common resources because it is not excludable. So overconsumption can happen. And this is called the tragedy of the commons. So this is really just a parable which tells you why common resources will get used more than is desirable with the point of the society as a whole. Basically, this parable will tell you that why there is this overconsumption happening in the case of common resources. So let's see what is this parable here. So we have cattle ranchers. So we have, let's say, a bunch of cattle ranchers. They share a common grassland. So it's a piece of nice grassland for their cattle. So if a rancher puts too many cattle on the grassland, overgrazing could happen. Right? So it's very easy to understand. And you can see that by putting each additional cattle, a rancher will get the additional benefits, but the cost is shared by all ranchers. So you can see that this gives you this interesting result. That is, if all ranchers, they're making their individually rational economic decision, then there will be overgrazing. So possibly this piece of nice grassland will just disappear. So the intuition is pretty simple. The key intuition here is, as a rancher, when you're thinking about how many cattle to raise, to put on this grassland, you will only think about the benefit to yourself. However, if your cattle, right, eat all the grass, then other ranchers won't be able to get these grasses. And you can see that basically the cost of overgrazing is shared, is divided by all other ranchers. So it's like you can get $10 of benefit. And if there are 10 ranchers, then each rancher will share $10 of cost. And you're just one of them. So your cost is just $1. So you will get a net gain of $9, right? So you will just keep adding more and more cattle on this piece of grassland. So there will be overconsumption. And in the end, this tragedy will just happen. That is, through this overconsumption, this piece of nice grassland potentially will just disappear. Okay. Okay, so let's summarize the tragedy of this common resource. So when one person is using a common resource because of the rivalry in consumption, this person's consumption will reduce other people's consumption. So basically this implies there is negative externality in consumption in the case of common resources. And when there is negative externality in consumption, then common resource will be consumed excessively. So how government can solve this problem? Well, the government can reduce the use of the common resources through regulation or taxes, or maybe the government can just turn the common resources into a private good. So in the case of the cattle rancher, you can see that the government can use regulation, right? So maybe the government can take some calculation, and after these calculations, the government find out the grassland can only hold 100 cattle. So the government can tell these ranchers, hey, there are 10 ranchers because the grassland can only hold 100 cattle. So the maximum number of cattle each rancher can put on this grassland is 10, right? So this is a regulation where the government can use taxes. The government can say if you have one cattle, then per hour you have to pay $10 tax. So if the government can precisely set the correct tax, then the tragedy will not happen. Or the government can basically turn this piece of land into a private property. Then this private property can charge fees, right? So in this case, again, the tragedy will not happen. And you can also see why negative externality in consumption will result in overconsumption. So if you draw this, so if you use this supply and demand curve. So this is, let's say, the supply curve. This is demand curve. Interestingly, now you will have two demand curve. Remember in the case of education, right? In chapter 10, we said education has positive externality. So in that case, you will have two demand curves. And the social value demand curve will be on the right of this private value demand curve if there is positive externality. Now, if there is negative consumption externality, for two demand curves, you will see that this demand curve on the right is the private value demand curve. This demand curve on the left is the social value demand curve. The social value demand curve is on the left because there is negative externality. So what you can see here is this quantity is the market quantity. And the quantity on the left is the efficient or optimum quantity. So this basically tells you that there is overconsumption, right? Because the market quantity is larger than the socially optimum quantity. This is due to the negative externality in consumption. Okay, so let's see the true-false problem. So if Toby and Pete are the only two fishermen in town, and neither is bothered by the other fishing, the lake, the fish, is not a common resource. This statement here is actually correct. I know in the lecture note we discussed that fish is common resource. It is common resource because there is rivalry. That is, if I fish, then you will be you will be bothered because my consumption of fish will reduce your consumption of fish, right? But here you can see that this problem specifically says neither is bothered, right? So if neither is bothered by the other fishing, it basically implies that there is no rivalry. So you can see that this is not a common resource. So in this case, if you maintain this assumption of no rivalry, then fish is public good. Second, roads can be considered either public good or common resource depending on how congested they are. So this is right? So basically, if it is congested, there is rivalry. Then this is common resource. If it is not congested, then there is no rivalry. So this is public good. Third, when one person enjoys the benefit of national defense, he or she reduces the benefit to others. This is false. Well, we know that national defense is a very typical example of public good. The government developed the patent system so that private inventors could make a reasonable profit from their own inventions. Obviously, this is like common sense, right? So this is true here. Most goods in our economy are allocated in the markets where buyers pay for what they receive and the sellers are paid for what they provide. This is clearly correct, right? Because the statement here says most goods, right? So this is correct. However, you can see that in the context of this chapter, if I change this most into all goods in our economy, then you can see that this is not right, because some goods, such as public goods and common resources, there is no price, right? So you cannot say all goods. A fireworks is not excludable because it is virtually impossible to prevent someone from seeing the show. Oh, this is easy, right? This is true. It's like a common sense. In some cases, the government can make everyone better off by raising taxes to pay for certain goods that the market fails to provide. So you can see that this is like the sentence from our lecture note, right? We know that in the case of public good, the private market will fail to provide it. So the government should raise tax, should charge tax to pay for this public good. Clean air and clean water are both public goods. Well, they're not public goods because there is rivalry in consumption, right? So this is false. To be more specific, clean air and clean water are actually common resources. There are no goods in this day and age that can be consumed without paying for them. This is clearly false because we know that you can find out a lot of consumption goods you don't actually need to pay for them, right? Such as parks. When goods are available free of charge, the market forces that normally allocate resources in our economy are absent. So this one is correct, right? Because we know that price serves a very important role to allocate consumption goods. And if price is missing, then this important force is missing. So the market force that normally allocate resources are missing. A free rider is someone who receives the benefit of a good but avoids paying for it. Well, I don't have too much to say this. Clearly, you can see that this is true. Okay, so you can see that chapter 11 is a very short chapter. And in some sense, you can see that there is this connection between chapter 10 and chapter 11, right? Because the fundamental reason that we have this failure of provision of public goods and overconsumption in the common resource is externality, right? We discussed externalities in chapter 10, and then we talked about the positive externality from providing public goods and the negative externality from consuming common resources. So you can see that externality is the common topic between these two chapters. Okay, now let's talk about the design of the tax system. So clearly you can see that the design of tax is very important, right? Because obviously we have actually discussed tax in several different chapters, right? So you can see that in the case of tax burden, right? We learned that in the market, if you charge taxes, then the side with smaller elasticity will bear more taxes, right? So you can see that when you're designing this tax, you have to think about tax burden. Then you have to think about the elasticities of demand and supply curve. And then we also discussed a very important topic, that is, we discussed the deadweight loss of tax, right? So to be more specific, now it is actually a good time to recall what we have learned. So we learned if you charge a tax, right? So the green bar is the tax. So if you charge a tax, then price, so this is the original price, this is price paid by buyer, this is price received by seller. So if you charge a tax, then price paid by buyer will increase. So consumer surplus will reduce. And the price received by seller will be lower. So producer surplus will be smaller. And then we learned that this little triangle is the deadweight loss from charging tax, right? And we also learned that the size of this deadweight loss is affected by the elasticity of demand and supply curve. To be more specific, we learned that if the demand and supply curves are more elastic, then the deadweight loss from tax will be larger, right? You can actually see this from pictures. We know that for deadweight loss, basically, if you have steeper curves, then we know that they have smaller elasticities, right? So basically, you can see that on the left-hand side, these curves have smaller elasticities. And on the right-hand side, these curves have larger elasticities. What you can see here is the deadweight loss on the right is larger, right? So this tells you that larger elasticity leads to larger deadweight loss. Of course, we know this. It's really because if demand and supply are more elastic, then it basically means that after charging tax, buyers and sellers, they will respond more to this tax, which means their reduction in their consumption and production will be larger. So this reduction will generate, so this larger reduction will generate a larger loss. Okay. So you can see that it's very important to for us to think about how to design taxes efficiently. And to think about this, we will think about the fundamental principle of taxation. So basically, what is our goal? Well, we want this tax system to be as efficient as possible and as equitable as possible. So we want this tax system to be efficient. Well, this implies that we wanted to reduce the cost from taxation. And we also want this tax system to be equitable, which means we want the burden of taxes will be distributed fairly. So let's first discuss efficiency. Right? So basically we have two goals. The first goal, so this one, is about efficiency. And the second goal is about equity. So we will now discuss the first goal. Okay. So how do we define the efficiency of a tax system? Well, we call that a tax system is more efficient if it raises the same amount of tax revenue at smaller deadweight loss and smaller administrative burden. So here you can see that we are thinking about two costs of taxation. The first is deadweight loss. The second is administrative burden. So whichever system has smaller deadweight loss and smaller administrative burden will be considered to be more efficient. And we know that is deadweight loss, right? So we just mentioned it's that little triangle we measured in previous chapters. And you have this deadweight loss because tax will change consumers and producers' decisions. The market quantity will be smaller. This will cause deadweight loss. And what is the administrative burden? Well, this burden will be imposed on both taxpayers and the government. So if there is tax, then taxpayers, they have to pay the cost because they have to comply with the tax laws. They have to file tax like every year. And then the government will also incur some cost because it has to enforce tax laws. So to be more specific, there are all kinds of administrative burdens. So here we have three examples. For example, as a taxpayer, right? The time you spend in filling out your tax forms and the time you spend in keeping records for tax purposes, right? And then from the government's perspective, the resources the government needs to enforce the tax laws, right? At least in Canada, the government has to set up this Canadian Revenue Agency, the CRA, to enforce tax laws, collect taxes, right? Obviously, the government has to pay for the building, pay for salaries. And here I give you a example I copied from internet like several years ago. So this Alvin of Tampa, right? So he complained. He was charged $490 to get back his tax refund, and he had to go back 3 times on the same day, and then he had to spend 5 hours, and he didn't get this gift card, I guess. And then he was very angry, right? Well, you can see several different types of costs imposed on this particular person, right? So this is monetary cost, right? So this is monetary cost. So almost 5 hours, this is a time cost. And this guy has to complain on internet. You can consider this as emotional cost, right? So Alvin had to pay 3 types of costs to file his tax. So you can see that this is a burden. Okay, now to discuss tax, it's very important for us to understand 2 definitions of tax rates. The first is the average tax rate. The second is the marginal tax rate. So what is the average tax rate? Well, it's quite easy. It's just total taxes you pay divided by your total income. So let's say if you have a total income of $100,000, and let's say in Canada for this amount, I guess you have to pay $35,000, right? So in this case, you can see that your average tax rate is 35%, right? Now, what about marginal tax rate? So it's essentially the tax rate on the margin. So it means the extra tax you have to pay for an additional dollar of income, right? So let's see this example here. So let's say, suppose the government taxes 20% of the first $50,000 of income. So let's say this is your $50,000 of income, and the tax rate is 20%, and then 50% of all income above $50,000. So let's say this person makes $60,000. Then you can see that for this person, right, for this first $50,000, his tax rate would be 20%, and for the other $10,000, his tax rate would be 50%. Now, what is the total amount of tax this guy has to pay? Well, it's $50,000 times 20% plus $10,000. Oh, sorry. Oh yeah, it's actually correct. Times 50%. So this gives us I think it's 10,000 plus 5,000. So it's 1500. And then what is the average tax? It's the total amount of tax divided by the total income. So this is 25%. Now, what is the marginal tax? What is the marginal tax? Well, for this marginal tax, you have to think about this. Let's assume this guy's income increases from $60,000 to $60,000 and $60,001, right? That is, there is a net increase of $1 in this person's income. Now, how much tax this guy has to pay? Well, so you can see that for this additional $1, he has to pay this additional $0.5 because the tax rate, right? The tax rate above $50,000 is 50%. So you can see that the marginal tax rate is the additional $1, right? So the marginal tax rate is the additional amount of tax divided by this additional $1. So it's 50%. Clearly, you can see that average tax rate and marginal tax rate, these are different things, right? So don't mix them up. Let's see another example here. So let's say you have $30,000. So you have $30,000. And for income under $10,000, the government charges no taxes. And for income above above $10,000, the government charges 15%. Now, what is your total amount of tax? Well, it's so your tax would be 0 plus 20,000 times 15%, which is 3,000. Yes, 3,000. Now, what is your average tax rate? It's 3,000 divided by your total income. So it's 10%. What is the marginal? Well, you can see here. When your income is above $10,000, for each additional $1, you have to pay 15% in tax. So this means the marginal tax is 15%, right? Okay. So why do we care about margin and average tax rates? Well, because both of them will give us some useful information. So first, to think about the sacrifice made by a taxpayer, then the average tax rate is useful because it tells us the chunk of income which is used to pay as taxes. Right? So it tells you the fraction of income paid in taxes. So basically you can see that for this person, right, we will use the 10% as the sacrifice of this taxpayer, because we know that 10% of all of his income is paid as income tax. However, to some sense, marginal tax is actually more important because it gives you the idea how incentives will be changed. So what does this changes in incentive mean here? Well, people, they make their decisions on the margin. So think about this. If you're thinking about whether you want to work for an extra hour, you will want to compare the income from this one extra hour with your labor cost of this one extra hour. For example, if you can get a benefit of $1 from this additional 1 hour working, but you will pay $2 of labor cost for this additional 1 hour working. In this case, you will not work, right? This is very easy to see. However, you can see that your benefit from this 1 extra hour of working depends on your marginal tax rate. Let me give you some numbers to make this easy to understand. So let's say you will earn $10 for 1 extra hour of work, right? This is your earning. And let's say your labor cost is fixed. So for 1 hour extra work, you will always pay $8 labor cost. Now let's say if tax rate or the marginal tax rate is 10%. What is your after-tax income for this 1 extra hour labor? Well, it's 10 times 0.9, right? It's $9. And this is larger than $8. So what's your decision? You will work, right? Now let's say the marginal tax rate is 40%. So what is your after-tax earnings for this 1 hour extra labor? it's 10 times 0.6, which is $6. This is smaller than $8, right? So what's your decision? You will not work, right? And you can see that in this case, you make your decision on the margin, because what you're really thinking about is this additional 1 hour of benefit versus this additional 1 hour of cost, right? So you can see that marginal tax rate is really useful in thinking about how incentives or your incentives for work will be affected, right? Okay, we will talk about the lump sum tax in the next lecture. So I will just stop here.